Hi, boys and girls. Well, today we're reading a longer version of Jack and the Beanstalk. It's going to give you a little bit of the backstory of why Jack and his mother are poor and that they weren't always like that. So as you can see, this book, as we go through it, it's kind of falling apart. But this is Jack and the Beanstalk, and there Jack is. The illustrations in this book are not as pretty and vivid as the one in the other book. This is the beginning, and as you can see, the book is really falling apart. But I hope you can read along with me. I'm going to try and get this centered so you can see the print. The story of Jack and the Beanstalk, and this says Jack and the Beanstalk. And I'll put my finger up every once in a while just to show you where we are, but I'm going to read in the regular speed that most of us are used to. In the days of King Alfred, there lived a poor woman in a country village many, many miles from London. She had been a widow for some years and had only one son named Jack, whom she indulged in every wish. In consequence, Jack did not pay the least attention to anything she said, but was an idle, careless, extravagant lad. This was not because he had a bad disposition, but because his mother had never checked him. By degrees she spent all she had. Scarcely anything remained but her cow. One day the poor woman met Jack with tears in her eyes. For the first time in her life she could not help scolding him. "Oh, you cruel boy! At last you have brought me to beggary and ruin. I have not money enough to buy bread for another day. Nothing remains but to sell my poor cow. It grieves me to part with her, but we must not starve." For a few minutes Jack felt sorry, but that was soon over, and he began to tease his mother to let him sell her cow at the next village. At last she consented. As Jack was going along, he met a butcher who inquired why he was driving the cow from home. Jack replied that he was going to sell her. Now the butcher had some curious beans in his hut. They were of various colors and attracted Jack's attention. "I'll give you my beans for her," he said, and so the bargain was quickly made, and Jack exchanged his mother's cow for a few paltry beans. Jack made his way home, calling aloud for his mother before he reached the cottage, thinking to surprise her. When she saw the beans and heard Jack's story, her patience forsook her. She threw the beans out of the window in her anger, and they flew in all directions, some falling in the garden. Then, throwing her apron over her head, she cried bitterly, having nothing at all to eat. They went supperless to bed. Next morning, Jack woke early, and seeing something uncommon darkened his window, he ran downstairs and out to the garden. There he found that some of the beans had taken root and sprung up surprisingly. The stalks were of immense thickness and entwined, so they formed a ladder like a chain in appearance. Gazing upward, he could not see the top. It seemed lost in the clouds. He tried the beanstalk and found it firm and not to be shaken. He quickly determined to climb to the top in order to seek his fortune, and ran to tell his mother, never doubting but she would be as pleased as he. She declared he should not go, said it would break her heart if he did, entreated, then threatened, but all in vain. Jack set out, and after climbing for some hours, reached the top of the beanstalk, fatigued and quite exhausted. Looking around, he found himself in a strange country. Not a tree, not a shrub, not a house, not a living creature was to be seen. Here and there were scattered fragments of stone, and at unequal distances small heaps of earth were loosely thrown together. It did not promise much in the way of fortune, he thought. Jack seated himself upon a block of stone and thought of the sorrow he had caused his mother in climbing the beanstalk against her will, and after a while he began to fear he must die of hunger. However, he walked on, hoping to find a house where he might beg something to eat. Presently he saw in the distance a handsome young woman, and as she came nearer he saw she was elegantly dressed, and had a small wand in her hand, on top of which was a peacock of pure gold. While Jack was looking at this charming person with great surprise, she came up to him and with a sweet smile asked how he came to be there. Jack told her all about the beanstalk. She asked if he remembered his father, and he told her he did not, that there must be some mystery about him, because when he asked his mother about his father, she would tell him nothing and always wept. He could not help noticing that she never answered his questions, and that she even seemed afraid of speaking, as if there was some secret connected with his father's history which she dared not tell. The young woman answered, "I will tell the whole story. Your mother must not do so. But before I begin, I require your solemn promise to do exactly what I command. I am a fairy, and if you do not perform exactly what I desire, you will be destroyed." Jack was frightened at her threats, but promised to do all she bade him, and then the fairy said, "Your father was a rich man. He was very good to the poor and constantly helped them. It was one of his rules never to let a day pass without doing some good to someone. On one particular day of each week he kept open house and invited only those who were poor but had once lived well. He always sat at the head of the table himself and did all in his power to make his guests comfortable. The rich and the great, however, were never invited. His servants were all happy and greatly loved both their master and mistress. Your father, though only a private gentleman, was as rich as any prince, and being both rich and good, was soon known far and wide. A giant lived a great many miles off, and he was altogether as wicked as your father was good. He was envious, covetous, and cruel, but he knew how to conceal those vices. He was poor and wished to get rich no matter how. Hearing your father spoken of, he decided it would be a good plan to make friends with him and get into his good graces. So he moved into your neighborhood and pretended he was a gentleman who had just lost all his possessions by an earthquake and had found it difficult to escape with his life. Your father believed his story and pitied him. He gave him handsome rooms in his own house, and he and his wife were treated like guests of importance. Little he thought that the giant, while receiving his bounty and pretending to be grateful for it, was plotting to make evil return for all his kindnesses. Things went on this way for some time, the giant daily growing more impatient to carry out his plan. At last came his chance. Your father's house was some distance from the seashore, but with the aid of a glass, the coast could be seen distinctly. One day the giant was using the telescope. The wind was very high, and he saw a fleet of ships in distress off the rocks. He hurried to your father, telling him about the ships and asking him to send all the servants he could spare to help the sufferers. Everyone was sent off at once except the porter and your nurse. The giant then joined your father in the study and appeared to be delighted, as indeed he was. Your father recommended a favorite book and was handing it down when the giant took his opportunity and stabbed him, and he instantly fell down dead. The giant left the body, found the porter and nurse, and at once killed them, for he was determined to have no living witnesses of his crimes. You were then only 3 months old. Your mother had you in her arms in another part of the house and did not know what was going on. She went into the study, but how shocked she was to find your father a corpse. She was stupefied with horror and grief and could not move from the spot. The giant, who was seeking her, found her in that state and was about to serve her as he had your father, but she fell at his feet and begged him to spare both your lives. Remorse seemed to fill the villain's heart for a moment. He granted your lives, but first made your mother take a most solemn oath never to tell you who your father was or to answer any questions about him, telling her if she did, he would certainly find it out and put you both to death. Your mother took you in her arms and fled with all possible haste. She was scarcely gone when the giant repented that he had allowed her to escape. He would have pursued her instantly, but he had to provide for his own safety, as it was imperative that he should be gone before your father's servants returned. Having gained your father's full confidence, he knew where to find all his treasure. He soon loaded himself and his wife with it, set the house on fire in several places, and when the servants came, the house was burned to the ground. Your poor mother, forlorn, alone, forsaken, wandered with you a great many miles from her home. At last she settled in the cottage where you were brought up, and it was owing to her fear of the giant that she never spoke to you of your father. She could not forget his threat of death if she disobeyed him. At your father's birth I became his guardian, but fairies have laws to which they are subject as well as mortals. A short time before the giant went to your father's house, I did something wrong, and to punish me, my power was taken away for a time, a most unfortunate thing, as I could not help your father when he needed me. The day you met the butcher as you were driving your mother's cow to the village to sell, my power was restored to me. It was I who made you take the beans in exchange for the cow. By my power the beanstalk grew to so great a height and became a ladder. I need not tell you now that I gave you the strong desire to climb that ladder and to seek your fortune, even though your mother did all she could to prevent your going. It was I who urged you on, who gave you no peace of mind. Now the giant lives in this country, and you are the one appointed to punish him for all his wickedness. You will encounter difficulties and dangers, but you must persevere in avenging the death of your father, or you will enjoy neither prosperity nor happiness. As to the giant's possessions, you must seize all you can, for everything he has is yours because it belonged to your father. One thing I desire. Do not let your mother know you are acquainted with your father's history until I see you again. Go along the direct road, and you will soon see the house where your cruel enemy lives. So long as you do as I order you, I will protect you. But remember, if you disobey my commands, a most dreadful punishment will be yours." When the fairy had concluded, she disappeared, leaving Jack to pursue his journey. He walked on until after sunset. Then he espied a great mansion. This sight revived his drooping spirits. He redoubled his speed and soon reached it. A plain-looking woman was at the door, and he accosted her, begging her to give him a bit of bread and a night's lodging. She expressed the greatest surprise at seeing him, saying it was quite uncommon to see a human being near their house. It was well known that her husband was a cruel giant, and that he would never eat anything but human flesh if he could possibly get it, and that he thought nothing of walking 50 miles to procure it, and usually being gone the whole day for that purpose. This terrified Jack, but still he hoped to escape the giant, and therefore he again begged the woman to take him in for one night only, and hide him where she thought he would be safe. At last she was persuaded, for she was both kind and generous, and she took him into the house. "I'll do what I can to keep you safely until morning," she said, as she led the way. "But if you knew my husband, you would not ask to stop here even for the night." First, they entered a fine, large hall, magnificently furnished. Then they passed through several great rooms, all in the same style of grandeur, but they were quite forsaken and desolate. A long gallery came next, very dark, just light enough to show that instead of a wall, there was a grating on one side which parted off a dismal dungeon from whence issued the groans of those victims the cruel giant kept in confinement. Poor Jack was half dead with fear, and would have given the world to have been with his mother again. He began to fear he should never see her again, and gave himself up for lost. He did not even trust the good woman but thought she had let him into the house for no other purpose than to lock him in the dungeon too. At the farther end of the long gallery was a very large kitchen, and a roaring fire was burning in the grate. The good woman told Jack to sit down, and she gave him plenty to eat and to drink. Jack soon forgot his fear, and was just beginning to enjoy himself, when there was a loud knocking at the street door, which made the whole house shake. The giant's wife ran to hide Jack in the oven, and then hastened to let her husband in. Jack heard him say to her in a voice like thunder, "Wife, I smell fresh meat." "Oh, my dear," she replied, "it is nothing but the people in the dungeon." The giant appeared to believe her, and walked into the very kitchen where Jack was hiding, more terrified than he had ever been. At last the giant seated himself quietly by the fireside, while his wife prepared supper. Little by little, Jack got over his fright sufficiently to look at the giant through a small crevice. He was astonished to see what an amazing quantity he devoured, and thought he would never have done with eating and drinking. At last, when supper was over, the giant asked his wife to bring him his hen. A very beautiful hen was brought and placed on the table before the giant. Jack's curiosity was very great to see what would happen, and soon he saw that every time the giant said, "Lay," the hen laid an egg of solid gold. The giant amused himself a long time with this hen, and meanwhile his wife went to bed. At last the giant fell asleep by the fireside, and snored like the roaring of a cannon. At the break of day, Jack, finding the giant still asleep, softly crept out of his hiding place, seized the hen, and ran off with her. He had some difficulty finding his way out of the house, but at last reached the road in safety. He found the beanstalk, and descended both better and quicker than he thought he could. His mother was overjoyed to see him. He found her crying bitterly, for she had concluded he had come to some sad end because of his rashness. Jack was impatient to show his hen, as you may guess. "And now, mother," he said, "I have brought home that which will make us rich quickly, and I hope to make up for the sorrow I have caused you." The hen laid as many golden eggs as they desired. They sold them, and in a little time they were as rich as they cared to be. For some months Jack and his mother lived very happily. Then Jack desired to travel. He remembered the fairy's commands, and feared if he delayed she would punish him, as she had threatened. Jack longed to climb the beanstalk and pay another visit to the giant in order to carry away some more of his treasures. For during the time he had been in the giant's mansion, and while hidden in the oven, he had learned from the talk between the giant and his wife that he had many wonderful things in his house. Jack thought of his journey day after day, but could not bring himself to speak to his mother about it. Sure, she would try to prevent him going. However, one day he boldly told her that he must take a journey up the beanstalk. She begged him not to think of it, and used every means at her command to keep him from carrying out his purpose. She told him the giant's wife would surely know him again, and that the giant wished nothing better than to get him in his power, that he might put him to a cruel death in order to be revenged for the loss of his hen. Finding all his arguments useless, Jack pretended to give up the point, though fully resolved to go. He had a dress made, which would disguise him, and found something which would color his skin. He thought no one would know him in this dress. A few mornings later he arose very early, colored his skin, and, unseen by anyone, climbed the beanstalk the second time. He was very tired when he reached the top, and very hungry too. Having rested for some time, he made his way to the giant's mansion. It was late in the evening when he reached the castle, and as he came nearer he saw the woman standing at the door. just as she had when he arrived before. Jack addressed her, telling her a pitiful tale, and asking that she give him some food and drink as well as a night's lodging. She told him what he already knew, about her husband being a powerful and cruel giant, how one night she admitted a poor young hungry friendless boy half dead with traveling, that the ungrateful fellow had stolen one of the giant's treasures, and ever since that her husband had been worse than before, continually blaming her for the misfortune. Jack knew at once he was listening to a story in which he himself was the chief actor. He did his best to persuade the woman to admit him, but he found it a very hard task. At last she consented and led the way, Jack observing everything just as it had been the time before. There was a great hall as richly furnished, and large rooms one after another, and the long gallery with the iron grating shutting off the dungeon. She took him into the kitchen, and after he had eaten, she hid him in an old lumber closet. The giant returned at the usual time, and walked in so heavily that the house shook. He seated himself by the fire, and soon exclaimed, "Wife, I smell fresh meat." The wife replied that it was the crows who had brought a piece of raw meat and left it on top of the house. While supper was preparing, the giant was ill-tempered and impatient, frequently lifting his hand to strike his wife for not being quick enough. However, she was always so fortunate as to elude the blow. He was also continually upbraiding her for the loss of his wonderful hen. The giant at last, having eaten enough to satisfy his voracious appetite, said to his wife, "I must have something to amuse me, either my bags of money or my harp." After a great deal of ill humor, and having teased his wife for some time, he commanded her to bring down his bags of gold and silver. As before, Jack peeped out of his hiding place, and presently saw the giant's wife bringing 2 very large bags into the room. One was filled with gold, and the other with silver pieces. Indeed, the coins made a merry clink, clink, each time the bags were moved, so that Jack thought he looked and listened. They were both placed before the giant, who began scolding his poor wife for staying so long. She replied, trembling with fear, that they were so heavy she could scarcely lift them, adding that she nearly fainted on the stairs, bringing them down owing to their weight. This exasperated the giant, so that he lifted his hand to strike her, but she escaped and went to bed, leaving him to count his treasure for amusement. The giant took his bags, and after turning them over and over to see what they were as he left them, he began to count their contents. First the bag containing the silver was emptied and the contents placed on the table. Jack viewed the glittering coins with delight, most heartily wishing them in his possession. Little thinking he was so closely watched, the giant counted the silver over several times. Then, satisfied that all was safe, he put it in the bag again, which he made very secure, using utmost care in wrapping the string and tying it in a knot drawn very tight. This done, the giant pushed it away with a deep sigh of satisfaction. The other bag was opened next. If Jack had been pleased at the sight of the silver, how much greater his delight at the heap of glittering gold! He was so bold as to think of gaining both bags, but suddenly, recollecting himself, he began to fear the giant would sham slumber the better to entrap anyone who might be concealed. The giant counted over the gold until weary, and then put it up even more securely than he had the silver, if such a thing was possible. Then he leaned back in his chair by the fireside and fell asleep. He snored so loud that Jack compared it to the roaring of a sea when the tide comes in and the wind is high. At last Jack concluded he was asleep, stole out of his hiding place and approached the giant. But just as he laid his hand on one of the bags, a little dog he had not noticed started from under the giant's chair and barked at Jack furiously. Jack now gave himself up for lost. Instead of trying to escape, he stood still, expecting the giant to awake every instant. Strange to say, however, the giant slept on, Jack began to have his wits about him, and on looking around saw a large piece of meat which he tossed to the dog. He instantly seized it and ran off into the lumber closet Jack had just quitted. Relieved of his noisy enemy, Jack boldly seized the bags and throwing them over his shoulder ran out of the kitchen. Reaching the street door safely, he found it daylight and quickly made his way to the top of the beanstalk. The money bags were really so heavy he could scarcely carry them, but he soon reached the bottom and at once ran to find his mother. To his great wonder, the cottage was deserted. He ran from one room to another. No one was there. He hurried to the village, and an old woman directed him to a neighbor's house where he found his mother ill with a fever. Jack was greatly shocked, blaming himself for her illness. On being told of her son's safe return, his mother improved and gradually recovered, and they lived happily and comfortably in the cottage. With the money Jack brought back, the cottage was rebuilt and well furnished. For 3 years Jack talked no more of the beanstalk, but he could not forget it, although he never mentioned it because he feared it would make his mother unhappy. She, too, would not mention it because it would remind her son of taking another journey. In spite of all the comforts Jack had at home, he often thought of the beanstalk. He remembered the fairy's threats if he disobeyed, and he could not be happy. He grew thoughtful, and often arose at dawn and gazed at the beanstalk for hours together. His mother, tired, tried to discover the cause, but Jack knew the consequence should she succeed, and did his utmost to conquer his desire to climb the beanstalk the 3rd time. At last he found he could not, and he secretly prepared to go. The longest day of the year he arose as soon as it was light and climbed the beanstalk and reached the top with some little trouble. When he arrived at the giant's mansion in the evening, he found the wife in the doorway as usual. Jack had disguised himself so completely she did not recognize him, but it took much pleading of hunger and poverty for her to admit him. But at last she consented and hid him in the copper. When the giant returned, he roared, "I smell fresh meat," and started to search the room. Jack was terrified and wished 1,000 times he was home. When the giant put his hand on the copper lid, the fright nearly killed poor Jack, but the giant never moved the lid, and finally seated himself by the fire. The giant ate a hearty supper and then called for his harp. Jack peeped under the lid and saw the most beautiful harp that could be imagined. He determined to have it. The harp was placed on the table, and its wonderful music soon lulled the giant to sleep. Jack stepped out and seized the harp, but being enchanted, it called out loudly, "Master! Master!" The giant awoke and quickly pursued Jack, but he had drank so much he could scarcely stand. Jack ran as fast as he could and gained the beanstalk, and the moment he was down, called for a hatchet. And this is just the caption under the picture, the same that we just read. The harp called out, "Master, master." There he goes. Just at that instant, the giant was beginning to descend. Jack cut the beanstalk off close to the root, which caused the giant to fall headlong into the garden. The fall killed him, and the world was released from its cruel enemy. Jack's mother was delighted when she saw that the beanstalk was destroyed. At this moment the fairy appeared. She explained everything about Jack's journeys up to the beanstalk and charged Jack to be a dutiful son and to follow his father's good example, for it was the only way to be happy. Jack begged his mother's pardon for all the sorrow he had brought to her, and promised to be dutiful and obedient in the future. And this is the story of Jack and the Beanstalk. Well, I've never heard all that explanation. I hope you enjoyed that wonderful story of Jack and the Beanstalk and the fairy, but I never heard about her. Until we read together again next time, boys and girls. Bye-bye.